diving right into it, which is good. But yeah, it's going to be a great program.
Nice. Okay.
And but with that, you should be good to go.
Okay. All right. Well, hello everyone that's seeing this through the stream as well. Today, obviously, as you all know, is International Human Rights Day, and I thought it would be apropos to begin this webinar with a reflection on human rights. And so I came across a few days ago a statement by UN Secretary General Antonio Gutierrez, his message for this year's Human Rights Day. So I'm going to read it, and I hope it puts you in the state of mind to start reflecting on what human rights mean to you and what you can do for the cause of human rights. So Gutierrez says, on Human Rights Day, we face a harsh truth. Human rights are under assault. Tens of millions of people are mired in poverty, hunger, poor health, and education systems that have not yet fully recovered from the COVID-19 pandemic. Global inequalities are running rampant. Conflicts are intensifying. International law is willfully ignored. Authoritarianism is on the march, while civic space is shrinking. Hateful rhetoric is fueling discrimination, division, and outright violence. And women's rights continue to be rolled back in law and practice. This year's theme reminds us that human rights are about building the future, right now. All human rights are indivisible, whether economic, social, civic, cultural, or political. When one right is undermined, all rights are undermined. We must stand up for all rights, always, healing divisions and building peace, tackling the scourges of poverty and hunger, ensuring healthcare and education for all, advancing justice and equality for women, girls, and minorities, standing up for democracy, press freedoms, and workers' rights, promoting the right to a safe, clean, healthy, and sustainable environment, and defending human rights defenders as they carry out their vital work. On this important day, let's protect, defend, and uphold all human rights for all people. So I hope you found that Antonio Gutierrez's statement relevant and useful. And I think that's what we're trying to do here today, particularly on looking towards the future. That is, in a few weeks, what we all can do in 2025 for the cause of human rights, and also to defend human rights defenders, especially in Central America and Guatemala, that are doing such important work. So with that, I'm going to turn it over to our first speaker, who is Grahme Russell from Rights Action. Grahme has been working on issues of extraction, of abuses by multinational corporations, especially North American, US, and Canadian corporations in Guatemala for a very long time. And we think that he represents one model of solidarity that takes place in Guatemala that we would like to highlight for you tonight. Grahme has some remarks, and so I'm going to hand it over to him and let him give us an initial presentation.
Well, listen, to the folks in Massachusetts, thank you for the invitation. I'm going to make a lot of generalizations and whip through a lot of points to try and let people know what is basically my framing and understanding of historic and systemic cycles of US and Western policies and actions in a country like Guatemala. I would make similar comments about Central America in general and much of Latin America, but as today's focus is on Guatemala, it'll be Guatemala. And to borrow an expression I'm sure I read many times somewhere else, perhaps a title for a presentation like this could be Empire's Punching Bag. My aim is to kind of set out how I understand and frame these issues and why I believe that there will be no fundamentally important transformational change in a country like Guatemala anytime soon. And it's not to be negative or cynical, it's just sort of a framework of understanding these issues and trying to take a bit of a long look at history and how and how we exist today as humans on the planet, in a planet that's characterized by such profound inequality and violence and corruption between rich countries and poor, between rich people and poor. Rights Action does two main things in our work, and we've done it for over 30 years in Guatemala. And as I said, we work in Honduras equally so, and I could make almost identical remarks about Honduras. The two main things we do is we do direct funding and support of community defense struggles and truth, memory, justice struggles. So we're a grassroots funder of first and last recourse. And by community defense struggles, I refer to land defense struggles, human rights defense struggles, environmental defense struggles, and they're usually all together. People are rarely struggling just for human rights and not the environment, and just the environment, not their land. It's usually all of these struggles go together. And most of these community defense struggles are in response to the violence, human rights violations, forced evictions, environmental and health harms of one or more sectors of the global economy. So we've worked a lot on mining-related resistance struggles. We've worked on Chishoy Dam, hydroelectric dam resistance struggles. We've worked on land defense struggles, community defense struggles related to the production of African palm for export, sugarcane for export, bananas for export, etc. They're all quite similar struggles. These are indigenous and non-indigenous people trying to stay on their land and being screwed over by the connivances of the wealthy elites in Guatemala and their international partners. And I'll come back to that. And that's sort of community defense struggles. The other area of our work on the funding and support side is truth, memory, and justice. And since the mid-90s, we've been more at sometimes, less at others. We've funded a large number of sort of grassroots community-based struggles, mainly in indigenous struggles that are trying to tell the truth about, recover historic memory of, and seek justice for mainly the crimes of the genocides and other crimes against humanity that took place in the 70s and 80s. And I'll come back to that. So that's one main element of our work, is the direct funding of these community defense struggles, truth, memory, justice struggles. And often it's the very same people doing both things, sadly and unfortunately enough. The other area of our work is education and activism, and we bring all of our stories north, all of our educational work, all of our denouncing work, and then all of our political and or legal activism is aimed at trying to hold the US and Canadian governments, and then our companies, the US military, and then international actors like the World Bank and the Inter-American Development Bank, et cetera, trying to hold ourselves accountable for how our policies and actions, government and private sector, contribute directly to and often benefit from the very harms that people on the ground in places like Guatemala suffer from systemically, predictably, logically. And the fundamental argument of a presentation like this, and why I think things aren't going to be able to change substantially in any time in the near future in Guatemala, is that if we don't achieve in transforming and holding ourselves accountable in the global north, in this case, mainly the US, but also Canada, with respect to Guatemala and Central America, then it's just really complicated to understand how a country like Guatemala can extract itself from this unjust, historic, and ongoing global north, global south, exploitative, global capitalist model, and bring about the transformational changes that it really needs. Couple notes. I'm both a US and a Canadian citizen, so oftentimes I say we interchangeably. If I want to be specific, I will be. Often I refer to something called the US-led West, whereas in the past, I think the US was long time the big elephant in the room in Latin America, including in Guatemala, and it remains so today in some ways. I think, to be fair today, it should be referred to as the US-led West. Canada is a significant actor, and increasingly so, in a lot of this stuff. The usual suspects from Western Europe, Britain, France, Spain, are significant actors in all this, usually in concert with Canada and the US. And then most global companies that I know of, a majority come from Canada and the US, whether it's in the mining and extractive industries or the food and ag industry sectors, but they come from companies around the world. And then the other institutions like the World Bank and the Inter-American Development Bank that we refer to a lot, these are fundamentally dominated by the United States and a series of very wealthy, powerful allies. And so I often refer to sort of the imperialism or the harms and violations that the US-led West contribute to and benefit from. And another thing I'm going to mention a lot in this talk is the so-called traditional elites. And loosely defined, the traditional elites that I refer to in Guatemala, and this could be similar for many countries around the world, are obviously the traditional economic elites of Guatemala. And they're quite definable. It's not like you have a membership card, but they kind of know who they are. And the leading journalists and academic activists and investigators kind of know who they are. And so there's the traditional economic elites, and then there's the military, then there's the police, then there's the three branches of government, which are the executive branch, legislature, and judiciary, administration of justice, and then the media. That's loosely defined what I'm referring to as the traditional elites. And as you're going to find out, they kind of control all of those facets of life. And that hasn't changed very much at all. And that is part of what, but to just confirm my speaking language. I would just say English. So I will refer to the traditional elites. And just as a as an advertisement, if I could recommend one historical book about all this that's most informed me about all this stuff, I would always refer back to Eduardo Galeano's book, Open Veins of Latin America. By this time in history, that book's slightly outdated on certain points, and so much more has been written by so many amazing writers and documenters. But if someone wants to recommend one book as a starting point book, I would go to that book, Eduardo Galeano's Open Veins of Latin America, any day of the week. And I highly recommend folks who are interested listen to a recently completed podcast, Under the Shadow, that was produced by Michael Fox in conjunction with NACLA and The Real News. And I'll leave it at that. I can send more information about both of those things. With the running the risk of boring or repeating stuff that some of the folks listening know, to get an honest understanding of Guatemala, I am going to give a bit of a historic timeline to understand what Guatemala is like today and how difficult it is today. Honestly, a discussion like this would start with a 500-year history of imperialism and colonialism and the land theft that took place. And the indigenous people are still the impoverished majority in Guatemala, and the roots of that go back through 500 years of history. In recent history, an honest, full discussion will look at how the US picked up on sort of Western European imperialism and colonialism. And over the last 200 years, it's often couched in the terms of the Monroe Doctrine. The US became the big elephant in the room, and it remains that way today. And I'd be glad to answer more questions about that. And this gets manifested in the 1800s when the forebears of companies like the United Fruit Company made their massive entry into Central America, including Honduras, Guatemala, and Costa Rica, and took over most of the very richest lands, which remains one of the fundamental underlying challenges and problems today. And the roots of it go back that far. Whipping ahead in history, before 1944, Guatemala was dominated by the US-backed military dictatorship of General Ubico, and the traditional elites ran the country in partnership with the United Fruit Company, etc. Then there was the 10 years of Guatemalan Democratic Spring. This merits a whole discussion in and of itself. What happened in those 10 years? It was amazing, extraordinary, uplifting, heartwarming. Then comes 1954. The United States, in partnership with the traditional elites, overthrows the government of Arbenz, and the rest is history. And then who gets returned to power in 1954? The traditional elites. They're just put back into power to pick up and continue with business as usual. And one of my main themes of tonight is there's zero accountability in the US for this coup. Nothing changed, no political accountability, no legal accountability, no one went to jail, no investigations, almost no media coverage, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. That's the common theme of the day. In the 60s and 70s, it's an amazing time of popular resistance, social movements, political movements, opposition parties, unions, et cetera, all through Guatemala, all through Central America, all through Latin America. And as the popular movements rise up and begin to take over more political space, demanding serious reform and change, and as small rebel movements crop up in Guatemala and other countries because so many people are being killed and assassinated, what do the traditional elites do but ramp up repression? So by the 70s and late 70s, disappearances are now becoming systemic. Assassinations of political leaders are becoming systemic, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. And if you need 2 hours to talk about the 1944 to 54 period, we'd need 2 days to talk about the genocides. There is no way today to underestimate how harmful, damaging, and destructive the genocides were in the 70s and 80s in Guatemala, and they were genocides, and the legacy that is being lived today in Guatemala. Fundamentally nothing has been done about the genocides. And they were fully US and Western backed. The US funded them, trained them, armed them, participated in them, legitimized them through the so-called war on communism, and brought in specific allies like France and Britain, the military regime in Argentina of the day, the military regime of Chile of the day, Pinochet, brought in Israel to add additional training during the worst years of genocide and repression. Zero accountability. So by the late 80s, early 90s, zero accountability. Once again, no political accountability, no legal account, blah, 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 blah. All the language in the early 90s in Latin America, in Central America, and Guatemala included, is the return to democracy. Now's the time to return to democracy. Signing peace accords. El Salvador had its peace accords. Guatemala had its peace accords. I was living there at the time. I was part of the movement of people that was just so enabling grassroots communities to overcome their fear and participate in the peace accords. It was a time of great hope. And at the end of the day, nothing changed. The international community formed their groups. Canada was a member of the Friends of Guatemala, Friends of Democracy. They all called themselves, we support the peace accords. We support the full implementation of the peace accords. This is Canadian policy, it's American policy. In our future relationships in Guatemala, we will be asking that the government of Guatemala abide with all the peace accords. One could talk hours about the content of all the different peace accords and the maps each one set out for profound social, economic, racial change in the country and justice for the crimes of the past. And little to nothing was accomplished. Because what happened was, by the early 90s, it was the traditional elites once again in power, dominating the political parties. And we entered into a period of 30 more years of almost the charade of democracy. And there was no viable option for any real electoral change, political change through the democratic process. And yet the West, Canada and the US primarily, called them our democratic allies. And this was the same traditional elites. And now the Guatemalan people began to refer to them more as the Pacto de Corruptos, the covenant of the corrupt, the pact of the corrupt one. It's basically the traditional elites. They controlled the legislative branch. They controlled the political parties. They controlled the electoral process. They controlled the judiciary, military, police, and they're still the economic elites doing business with the international community as usual. Then there's this amazing electoral surprise in last year. In the first round of elections, a new party, Semilla Party, snuck in and became second in the vote. And since no party got over 50%, they had to go to a runoff. And this shook up the pot. This created an amazing outpouring of groundswell support for real electoral change. And literally, it was going to lead to the first actually democratic electoral change since 1951. When Arbenz was elected government in the second part of the Democratic Spring. For some people, that might be a stretch and an oversimplification or overgeneralization. But I don't think there was any fundamental real democratic change of government, if we look at the meaning of democracy and electoral politics, honestly, from 1954 right through to 2023, 2024, this year. And there was a huge election defense battle all through the second half of 2023. And Rights Action, like many other groups who were just grassroots supporting it, denouncing it, denouncing the corruption, blah, blah, blah. And for a whole series of interesting reasons, the new president, Arevalo, who's actually the son of one of the presidents in 1944 to 1950, he was allowed to take power. I don't say that too flippantly, allowed to take power, because in different circumstances, he would have been in jail in different circumstances, or perhaps even assassinated and not allowed to take power. For a complicated bunch of reasons, he was allowed to take power. And how good was that? That was a merit, well earned, and amazing sort of popular electoral defense struggle all through 2023 into 2024. Since 2024, since he's come to power, I think what Guatemala's just evolved to is back to business as usual. There's a new democratic government in power, and I'm glad. They control the executive branch of government with an inexperienced but sort of very serious executive branch trying to make the best of things. And to exaggerate the point or play with numbers a bit, I think they effectively control about 3 to 4% of power in the country. They have fundamentally no real power to bring about change. They don't control the governorships in which would be like state governments in the US or provincial governments in Canada. They don't really control the municipal governments, though there are some good municipal governments across the country. They have no control in Congress. They haven't been able to clean out the systemic corruption in the judiciary one iota since they came to power, which is like a massive elephant in the room. And they don't control the police and military. This is a government with a depleted treasury and very little power and control over what they're allowed to bring about change to. I still have a lot of respect for what they're trying to do, and they're bringing about and implementing some very important small changes. But I think if you look at things that Guatemala desperately needs since about 500 years ago, like land reform and land redistribution, like a complete reform of the electoral democratic processes in the country, a complete cleansing and reform of the judicial process, they will not be able to achieve any of this in any measurable way in their 4 years of power. And I just highly suspect that the traditional elites are now just preparing the terrain to block this government for any significant change in the next 4 years that affects their interests and the interests of their international business partners, like Canadian mining companies, so that after 4 years, they'll just say, well, that government wasn't able to do very much. And the next elections will come and go. And that would be my worst case fear, is that they'll just be out after 4 years, and it'll be another electoral government dominated by the traditional elites doing business as usual with the international community. So where does that leave us? Because with this, I'm going to sign off. In terms of discussion, I always think that there's two fundamental break lines of what one can do about this. And one is to directly support amazing community development projects, community defense projects, human rights struggles, human rights defenders on the ground, taking the lead in their own work, environmental defense, educational projects. We're about to hear about Santa Maria Tzeja, et cetera, all the above. Directly support them. Or when we bring the stories north, hold ourselves accountable for foreign policy and the policies and actions of our company, whether it's in Guatemala, the Congo, Nicaragua, South America, or wherever it is. It remains the historic and fundamental struggle, I think, of caring and concerned Canadian and American citizens. How do we hold ourselves accountable when our governments and companies and banks and investors go around the planet, commit atrocities directly or indirectly, benefit from it, and get away time in and time out? And I'm going to leave it at that. That's sort of my overall framing of understanding. And as you'll see, I didn't delve into any sort of specific issues in Guatemala. beyond glancing over that history. And I'd be glad to answer more specific questions in the question and answer period. But I set it out this way because I think that the challenges facing so many countries in the global south and so many people in the global south are daunting beyond daunting. And it has everything to do with how we work as rich and powerful countries, poor and dominated countries, let alone all the inequalities inside our borders. Those are the fundamental challenges to focus on, I would say. Thank you.
Thank you, Graham. That was an excellent, I'm sure all of our audience agrees with me in saying that that was an excellent, not only historical, but also political and economic analysis of Guatemala currently in its contemporary politics and its institutions and its structures. So we really appreciate that. And I think, just to add a quick reflection, your work, the work of Rights Action has been so instrumental in pointing out the areas where we can, as North Americans and US citizens, help to hold our government and companies accountable. I'm thinking of an example of that our working group from a few years ago led when we led a short campaign against a Massachusetts company called Simons that was constructing a hydroelectric dam in Gilomito, Honduras. And so while it's not in Guatemala, it is related to Rights Action's work, and it is exemplary or symbolic of many of the types of extractive and exploitative projects that US and North American companies are doing in Central America and places like Guatemala and Honduras. So we will get to actions and issues and areas where we can support and participate in as North Americans later in the program, but I thought I would just add that brief reflection to your presentation. So now, going second, but certainly not certainly not secondary to Grahme, we have Ali Durbin. Ali is a leader of the Needham Guatemala Partnership. She was raised in Needham, Massachusetts, and grew up there, I believe. So she's from our local Greater Boston area. And she has been living in Guatemala for many years. So she's calling in from Guatemala, I would assume. And she's going to talk about this wonderful partnership that starting with the Needham Congregational Church has with the predominantly Maya village of Santa Maria Tzeja in Guatemala. So without further ado, Ali, please take us away for a wonderful presentation about SMT.
Thank you so much, Derek, for your introduction and also for being such a wonderful, thoughtful, engaged delegate at a delegation this year to Guatemala. I also want to thank Sunny Robinson for having the idea and initiative of having this event. Thanks to Grahme for your insightful comments. And also thanks to Brian Garvey for managing this webinar. I am indeed calling in from Guatemala, and I would like to share a bit of a presentation with you. So hopefully the technical piece will behave. So solidarity can involve grappling with global, broad global dynamics. It can also be forged over a basket of tortillas in someone's home or through a pen pal relationship. That's exactly what happens with the Guatemala Partnership that links people from Massachusetts and beyond with the indigenous community of Santa Maria Tzeja in Guatemala. Santa Maria Tzeja was founded by Quiche Mayas and Mestizos who had been working in exploitative conditions on coastal plantations in Guatemala, who learned that there was land available in the Ixcan, a 3-day walk away. They were undaunted. They organized to form a cooperative and made the trek in the 1960s and 70s. They had to build the community from the ground up in the remote region, which had no electricity, no running water, essentially no buildings or even roads. Yet Becoming free of the plantation conditions, they were able to till their own land, manage their own resources, and govern with independence and autonomy. In 1982, at the height of the genocide against Maya peoples that Grahme mentioned, the Guatemalan army invaded Santa Maria Tzeja, massacred people, burned the homes, burned their fields. Most people in the community did manage to survive by fleeing to their fields, and then they hid in caves in the forests. Then the community split in two. One group fled to Mexico to seek refuge there, and another group returned to their community where they were forced to live under military control. 12 years later, and after much organizing, the refugees returned home, and in 1994, Santa Maria Tzeja was reunited. Today, Santa Maria Tzeja is a vibrant, robust community. It's known for its high levels of development, education, and organizing to defend its land, livelihood, and culture. Meanwhile, in the 1980s, the Congregational Church of Needham, Mass., in a project led by Kay and Clark Taylor, wanted to take action against US-backed violence and displacement being committed in Central America. They learned about Santa Maria through Chilean anthropologist Beatriz Mans, who suggested that the community could benefit from a set of international eyes to dissuade further egregious human rights violations. Kay, Clark, and Beatriz are all pictured in this image on their way to Santa Maria. Representatives from Needham and Santa Maria Tzeja met and agreed to be sister communities, not knowing yet what exactly that would mean. So in 1987, a partnership was born between a war-torn indigenous community and a largely middle-class and white US suburb. Now the Guatemala Partnership has expanded well beyond the Needham Church and includes members across the United States and beyond, and has formed a secular nonprofit called Partners for Guatemala Education. So now 37 years strong, how does this model of solidarity work? Twice a year, multi-generational North American delegates visit their sister community of Santa Maria Tzeja. Delegates visit homes, share meals, hear stories, meet with leaders, hold skill shares in the schools and the library, and reach mutual agreements about partnership dynamics. We also make tortillas and chocolate from local corn and cacao, swim in the river, play games, try backstrap weaving, sit in on middle school quiche classes, and play music together. Basically share in the daily lives of people in Santa Maria Tzeja in a very unique and close way. To date, we have held over 70 delegations. Delegations can be eye-opening, life-changing, and transformative. At a meal in a home, a basket of tortillas is shared between people from different parts of the globe and different sides or parts of the global systems of oppression, who connect across differences of language, culture, nationality, race, and power. This is all in the background as we talk about our lives, our families, our problems, and our hopes. Well, perhaps as in this case, shelling cacao beans together. We have tried to host delegations of Santa Maria representatives to Massachusetts, but this has rarely been possible due to US immigration policies. A core element of the partnership are the partner-family relationships between families in Santa Maria and families in the North. Particularly astounding in this era of social media, these 100 or so families write each other letters back and forth twice a year to share about their lives. You can get a sense of how special, long-lasting, and genuine the relationship can become from this recent line in a letter from Don Bartolo. Well, friend, I guess we will be friends until we die. The partnership also supports community development projects, particularly in the areas of education, healthcare, and the local economy. Importantly, these projects are determined and managed by Santa Maria Tzeja leaders based on their values and priorities. In addition, partnership members engage in social justice work, including around US immigration policies and ongoing genocide trials in Guatemala. What are some factors behind this project's longevity and success? On the Santa Maria Tzeja side, the community is highly organized, which is why they have made so many achievements in sustainable development, education, healthcare, and environmental protection. They use democratic and inclusive decision-making processes and an ancestral system of collective work known as faena. Santa Maria Tzeja is committed to its founding values and principles of freedom, self-governance, food sovereignty, collective well-being, resource preservation, cooperative economics, progressive education, cultural pride, and resistance. Key elements on the US side are a deep commitment to follow the lead of our sister community, including honoring community decisions, policies, processes, and leadership, coupled with the willingness to go outside our comfort zone to another land with other ways, and to question and challenge the inequalities that separate our two communities. The guiding principles behind this partnership in themselves are a form of solidarity in action. They include respect, reflection, close listening, clear and open communications, humility, open-mindedness, mutual support, trust, and understanding. Framing these in list form may make it sound simple, but in practice, it involves questioning assumptions and norms, carefully considering, trying, making mistakes, seeking feedback, trying again, redoing, double and triple checking. Both sides of the partnership dedicate time, energy, and hard work to make the partnership prosper. On the Guatemala side, this includes the Herculean task of hosting the delegation and coordinating activities, as well as patiently explaining local practices and handling problems that arise, from cultural mishaps to guest house maintenance issues. On the US side, these efforts include monthly meetings, administrative and financial details, and fundraising endeavors such as the annual yard sale and serve-a-thon. What have been some of the partnership's impacts? On the US side, activism has strengthened, including former delegates who have gone on to work for immigrant and indigenous rights, social and environmental justice. One example is Amanda Kistler, who has gone on to work for Nisqua and Ciel. Also, one early supporter of the project, a church member who used to handle union negotiations for the company side, was exposed to other perspectives thanks to the relationship with Guatemala. He came to learn, understand, and eventually advocate for workers' rights and union organizing. On the Guatemala side, partnership support for education and development has helped Santa Maria reach collective goals, such as improving the schools and building this farmers' marketplace to exchange local goods and services. The partnership scholarship program has helped over 110 eager students attend high school. This increased access to education has enabled community members to pursue their dreams and also take on new roles in social movements, court cases, and more. Santa Maria graduates have been prominently involved in anti-corruption movements, consultation processes to protect their territories against imposed mega projects, and trials against former dictators for genocide and crimes against humanity. This partnership exemplifies the seemingly simple but powerful act of showing up and walking with. Even back before there were cell phones to confirm that a delegation would arrive on a certain date, back before there was a road to get to the community, Santa Maria Tzeja trusted that the delegation would show up, so they made the 4-hour trek to the neighboring town to pick them up. At the same time, the delegation trusted that someone from Santa Maria would show up to guide them at the trailhead, or else they would surely get lost in the jungle. Each time, both sides trusted, and both sides showed up for each other. They trusted because of the groundwork of respect, mutual appreciation, and understanding that had been forged. Today's delegations benefit from unique, intimate welcomes into people's homes and lives because of those who came before and treated the experience with honor, care, and gratitude. I really want to highlight the power, marvel, and beauty of the people-to-people connections made on delegations, through letters, and at workshops and meetings. The tasty delight of making chocolate together in Doña Dolores' home, the piercing sadness of hearing how Don Emilio survived military capture, the hope behind a new court case against the corrupt, the excitement of receiving a letter with news from a longtime faraway friend, the thrill of playing the recorder or dancing to the marimba together. All of these shared emotions and experiences move us to deeper compassion and solidarity. As Lila Watson calls us to do, we begin to realize that our lives and our liberation are bound together. Over tortillas and letters, amidst conversations, hugs, tears, and laughter, we pursue a more just and equitable world together. Thank you.
Thank you, Ali, for that great presentation, that beautiful reflection. I think you might have mentioned, or you mentioned at the beginning of your presentation, I myself have been to Santa Maria Tzeja as recently as this past summer. So I'm just going to give just a brief, my own reflection on SMT and what makes this partnership so special. So I have been on other types of delegations to Latin America and Central America. I've been to El Salvador, I've been to Honduras, I've been to Cuba as well. And through those delegations, they were incredible experiences. Some of them were more politically oriented and about learning about La Lucha and the struggle that land defenders and water defenders are undergoing for their land and their rights. And so I was looking for a different experience. And Sunny was keen to and had been telling me for a couple years about the Needham partnership. And so this partnership, she always told me that this is where you'll see what solidarity is and person-to-person relationships are really about. And so I learned that the root of solidarity is really all those virtues that you were talking about, Ali. That really it comes down to friendship and family and being in relationship, right? And each delegation, as I've seen, it really does benefit from those years and decades of trust that's been built up. And that's over now 1, 2, and 3 generations. So I commend the experience, and anyone that wants to go on the delegation to SMT, I would commend it to you. And I would just link it to because I am a Harvard Divinity School student, and so I studied theology and religion. I will link it to a very important quote from a prominent theologian that just passed away about a month and a half ago. Many of you know him and know about him because he's very famous, but Father Gustavo Gutierrez. So another Gutierrez tonight. And Gustavo said, in addition to writing the Theology of Liberation, which was probably the founding text of liberation theology, he's known for writing about the spirituality of liberation. So the spiritual aspect and the necessity of being in community and in relationship with the poor. And so Gutierrez wrote in one of his works that if there is no friendship with them, the poor, and no sharing of the life of the poor, then there is no authentic commitment to liberation, because love exists only among equals. And that quote comes from a Theology of Liberation. So that is basically what you just said, Ali, but in different words. So so we have Father Gutierrez to back us up. But I just thought I would share that because that was what I was looking for when I came to go on the delegation to Guatemala through the partnership, and that's what I found. So that's my reflection. And now we're getting to the end of the hour, so that means it's time for questions. And we have a ton of wonderful questions from our audience. Some of you who have been private messaging me with additional questions. So Brian and I have been busy collating them and sorting through them. So we're going to start with and we have till 7:30, so we have plenty of time to answer all the questions. So if you have not, just as a reminder, if you have not put in a question in the chat, please do so. So we'll start with some more general questions here, which Grahme spoke to in his presentation, which is what promise or what hope is there for the new Arevalo administration for Guatemala? So what is the promise of this new administration for Guatemala? What can we expect from the administration? So let's start with that, and then we'll continue on with more questions.
Well, let me keep this brief. For those that follow Guatemala, it was quite extraordinary, the explosion of nationwide, countrywide activism from July forward. Don't need to go into the details why July and the first round of elections, the second round of elections. That's how it came about. And somehow there was a legitimate opposition party for the first time, in my view, since 1954, to, you know, a political party that was just put up and controlled in one degree or another by the Pacto de Corruptos, the traditional elites. That's the generalization. And people got it across the country. They were amazed. And then all of a sudden, the traditional elites crashed down and tried everything they could to render illegal the party, try and file criminal charges against the leaders, blah, 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 blah. It didn't work for some complex national and international reasons. But this is part of the answer to your question. The yearning and desire and understanding amongst the Guatemalan people of what real change and transformation can and would look like is mind-numbing across the country. And I do want to harken back to what I said about the genocide. It remains incomprehensible today to underestimate how damaging and destructive the 70s and 80s and the genocide were. The genocide writ large, the 1.2 or 1.3 million people forcibly evicted from home and community, refugees here, internally displaced there, hundreds of thousands of killed, mass graves, disappeared. And this was a country of 8 million plus. It destroyed the fabric of society, and that was part of the intent of the genocide. And it's barely been able to recover right through till today because the hopes of the 90s were dashed by the early mid-2000s. There was no hope for any transformation. And so there's a yearning in the country, but people are also used to corrupt ruling. What can you do? Go to the US, migrate, or eke out a living, whatever. And I'm being a bit simplistic here. So the yearning is there and the hopes and aspirations were there. A key point in the election defense struggle was that Indigenous people after Indigenous people spoke out and said, we are not in defense of the Samia party in and of itself. This is a new party. We respect the leader. We know about his family history and good luck. We are in defense of the electoral process and our right to participate democratically because they know that the elections has been a farce called democratic elections by the US-led West for decades. Oh, democratic elections, democratic government. The people of Guatemala know that it's fundamentally a farce every 4 years. And so they said, we're in defense of this process. So then Arevalo takes power and under great fanfare and well-deserved. And I think he's trying to do everything the right way so far. The problem is he has really little real control over any fundamental decisions, which was the comment I made earlier. It's still too soon in his mandate, which is less than a year old, to answer the question fully and properly. But unless there is a real shift, the international community is not going to change one iota. Canada and the US are going back to business as usual. We're promoting the expansion of our mining companies, extractive industries, that all through the electoral struggle last year, the US started to speak out about the corruption of certain leaders, and we're going to put them on the corruption list and the Magnitsky list and this list and the other list. They listed like 40 or 50 people. It's like, holy smokes, that's a lot of corrupt people. How did you know? Anyway, look at all these corrupt people. The US has done nothing about it whatsoever. Those people are still in power today. They're still dominating the judicial branch, which is the biggest sort of cog in the wheel right now. It's not the underlying problem. I think the economic model is, which is a local to global economic model, free trade agreements, global markets, this, that, and the other thing, and how the traditional elites, the landowners, control all the land and they do business with the international business. But the cog in the wheel for any fundamental change is the judicial system and the corruption of the judicial system. And we're just watching one amazing crimes against humanity trial after another, including a genocide trial, going down the toilet by the corruption of judges, the corruption of prosecutors, the buying this, that, and the other thing. And so Arevalo's government to date has not been able to make a dent whatsoever into the control that the traditional elites have with the judicial branch, let alone the military, police, and the economic model. Can he do it in the next 3 years? I don't think he will, honestly, because he won't get any help from the so-called international community, which means the US-led West. The World Bank is not going to come in and help this. The IMF is not going to come in and help this. Canada and the US are not going to come in and sort of arrest those corrupt people and extradite them to the US to put them on corruption trials. We're not going to get involved because we have business and political interests in Guatemala, pure and simple. Hopefully I'm wrong on that, but I think that's true. The one thing that Semilla Party might do, and I'm not sure that they will, is they would reach out to the grassroots, indigenous-led movements across the country and say, let's go after the Attorney General. Let us work together. We will work the political system and the legal system as best we can, which is corrupted. You make your choices to bring whatever political, legal pressure you can bring to bear to bring down the Attorney General herself. Her name's Porras. She's just a cog in the wheel, and she represents the traditional elites. If he went the grassroots movement, and I don't think he will, I don't think he has the political, that's not his political vision, in my opinion. I would love him to do so, but then there's huge risks, of course, including risks of repression to him and the Semilla Party itself, risks of repression. That would be my one hope for some more substantial change in the next 4 years, because it would also do a second thing. Even if they could bring down the Attorney General, there's going to be a big battle in 2 years to replace her in the normal course of events. But it would galvanize a real political opposition party. The Semilla Party has no base in the countryside. It's not a popular political party that came up from below, like Evo Morales' party in Bolivia, like 20 years ago or whatever. This was a bit of a surprise, slipped in the side door, and then things took on a life of their own. If Arevalo and his cabinet and his brain trust could say, we are going popular, we're going to mobilize the indigenous people, we're going to empower them, we're going to enable them, we're going to lift them up so that they can lift us up, then the Semilla Party could transform itself into a real sustainable party of opposition, so that in 4 years they could, barring corruption, repression, killings, etc., they could win a second round of elections and try and have a second 4 years and then a third 4 years. Because to transform a country like Guatemala, you need about 30 to 40 years to really bring some transformational change, one administration after the other. I'll leave it at that.
Ali, your thoughts?
I think Graham covered it all. But yeah, my main point would have been just that the recognition and acknowledgement of Indigenous leaders is something that is new in the country because of the massive mobilization last year to honor their election results. And so that's a point of hope that I see, not so much from what's happening within the government, but in society as a whole. And I think also there's been an awakening, and Graham talked about this a bit, but an awakening of people in general to the workings of certain aspects of public policies, decision-making, and they're paying more attention to details that they didn't used to. So for example, when the new governors were named, that was always a process that no one paid attention to in the past. This time people were really aware of that and looking into the different nominees, partly because Arevalo himself made it a more open process, but also because of this political learning, awareness, and education that had happened through these over 100 days of public protests to support the election results.
So I think this leads us naturally to a sort of related topic, since we're on the topic of indigenous groups and civil society, which is the phenomena of the genocide trials and the crimes against humanity. And so why exactly, why exactly is this such a prominent strategy in Guatemala, and what is, indigenous groups hoping to accomplish through these trials. I think this is a good way to sort of wrap in the question about the Garcia trial and the recent news that just happened with with the suspension of that trial. So so if Grahme and Ali, if you could, or maybe let's go Grahme first, and then we'll do Ali. If you could talk a little about the prominence of these trials.
Can you just ask the why part again? Are you asking why people choose to do justice struggles in the court system, or why and how they overthrow them and screw them on the side of the traditional elites?
It's more of the former. Why is it such a prominent strategy? I'm just thinking of, from my own experience in Guatemala, meeting with some of these groups like the AGR that basically, view reconciliation as coming through justice, truth and justice, right? Not an either or scenario. Some would say, oh, it's 40 years in the past, it's time to move on. It's a lot of, some critics will say that. So why is it such a prominent strategy? Why does it continue 40 years later? And then the other part of the question is, what are they hoping to accomplish with the trials?
Yeah. Well, literally, they're trying to accomplish justice, but this goes back 70 years or more, just in recent history. The people of Guatemala, the people of Honduras, the people of all these countries, they try and use the institutions of state. They try and use the electoral system to form good opposition parties and get elected, and it gets crushed through corruption, repression, violence. They try and use the court system because that's what court systems are for, administration of justice, civil law, criminal law, etc., to try and hold the powerful accountable. This is what we all know this at home in Canada and the US. This is what our courts are for. And you either go through political oversight bodies and or the legal process. They're trying to use their legal system for all the reasons why it would make any sense for anyone anywhere to try and use your legal systems to resolve issues, whether they're spats between neighbors or issues of the most serious kind, like genocide and crimes against humanity, etc. And so that's the basic answer. And it's nothing particular to Guatemala. All across the Americas, I know best the Americas and particularly Central America, but it's all across the world. People are trying to achieve accountability and justice and change through the court system because that's what they're set up to be. That's what they're held out to be. And to push the matter further, right back to US and Canadian policy, we swear publicly that we abide by the rule of law in Guatemala. We uphold the democratically elected governments of Guatemala. And when we go there to do business with our mining companies or whether, our companies abide by the rule of law. Everyone buys into the fiction of law, but it's only really the people of Guatemala in this case that are trying to actually make the legal system work. And if and when they get close to having any success, that's when corruption comes in. That's when repression comes in. That's when all the rest comes in. And sooner or later, most, if not all, serious political / human rights issues that even work their way into the Guatemalan courts will get undermined, overthrown, crushed, or torn apart one way or another. It's all of the above. And the most recent example is just this amazing genocide trial against Benedicto Lucas Garcia, who was the brother of the dictator from 1978 to 1981. I can't quite remember the dates. There was two main genocidal generals, as they're referred to, Lucas Garcia and then Arias Montt. Benedicto Garcia is the brother of Lucas Garcia. They were all genocidal. This was a genocidal project in the late 70s and early 80s. And as I said earlier, the US was fully aware of it, supporting it, funding it, and legitimizing it, and should be held legally accountable still today. There's no prescription time on these types of crimes anywhere in the world. So there's been a number of genocide trials, and this one's sort of linked to the original one against Arias Montt, but it's taking on a new life of its own. And I don't know all the legal details, but I don't think they matter. The corruption of the legal system allowed them to, certain judges and prosecutors, to get it overturned and quashed. And I legally speaking, I actually don't know where it stands right now today. What I do know is that once again, through hook and crook, the corrupt legal system had it overturned. And one can get lost in the legal maneuvering of each particular case. But what one sees, if you look back through 20 years now of crimes against humanity trials and genocide trials, is that the pattern, the result is always the same, one way or another, through threats. They've run judges into exile. They've threatened them, and they put them in jail. They've filed criminal charges against prosecutors, judges. Some go into exile, some are stuck in jail. Like, it's a relentless onslaught by the traditional elites to weaken, undermine, but then overtake the administration of justice so that their judicial operators, as they call them, judges, prosecutors, and then state lawyers, they get the results they want because they have the judge they want. And the details of the genocide case that's just been sort of crushed right now against Benedicto Garcia, I don't know the particular details. I don't think they matter that much.
Ali, anything you want to add?
Sure. Well, just to add a couple of things. One is with this current case, I agree with Grahme that that's a broader picture, and that the details, they basically they're trying different ways to delay or stop these processes. But in this moment, I would say the people are living through a really demoralized and frustrating moment because this trial has been going on since April. So there's been hundreds of witnesses, eyewitnesses to the massacres, to members of their family being disappeared, being tortured, who have come to trial. There's been extra witnesses. The trial went all the way up to the end. They had already done the concluding arguments when the defense team put in a recusal and a court agreed. And so now what it looks like is that they're going to have to redo the entire trial. So if you think, 9-10 months, people coming from their communities to have to talk about the most painful moment of their lives, and they're going to have to do it again without knowing the outcome. So I wanted to mention that, but I also wanted to mention in terms of the question of what do people hope to achieve? I think that the witnesses, while they're hoping for justice and accountability, they know that there's a slim chance they're going to get it. And there are other elements that they're looking for. Some they want to have a day in court. They want to be able to stand up in an official setting and be covered by the media as well, and to tell of what happened to them, to have that heard when for so many years they were silenced. Anyone who spoke out about this would also be persecuted, being killed. And so to have that moment in court of having their story be heard is very powerful. And there's also an element of wanting to increase awareness in Guatemala and around the world of what happened here, and passing it on to the next generation. And so you'll often hear people talking about the importance of historical memory, that these stories and these testimonies not get forgotten, and that at the very least the children, the grandchildren, and the new generations know that this happened.
Yeah, thank you, Ali. That's a really important concept that I don't think I think Grahme might have mentioned it, but I'm glad we brought up again, historical memory. It's a very important concept for us to keep in mind here when we're talking about these trials and what the purpose of them is and how they're a tool for preserving that. So there's a couple other questions here that I want to get to, but there's one from the audience that's a very specific question about a specific legal case, I believe. So I'm not sure if our speakers can address it, but it's related to what we're talking about. So I thought I'd bring it up. So someone from the audience asked, related to justice and the legal system, could someone speak on what progress the precedent-setting Comunidad Indígena Mayaquiche Agua Caliente versus Guatemala case number 13.082 has had, is having, or may bring for Indigenous people in the region to fight extractivist corporations? So I'm not sure if either of you are familiar with this case. I might just put it in the chat just so that you all can see it in writing.
Whoever asked the question, they might want to reconfirm or say, no, that's not what I'm talking about. I believe they're talking about a community that's also known as Lote 9, Lot 9, out in the El Astor region. I don't know if there's a way for you to confirm whether that's Agua Caliente. I'm pretty sure it's the same community. And it's a complicated story related to 60 years of a Canadian mining nightmare in Guatemala. It's not funny. That we've worked on an awful lot. But so yeah, I think I should wait and find out, like, because I
Okay.
could go on for hours about this case, and then they'll say no, that's not.
Okay. So what we can do is we'll add some we'll put some
Yeah,
information
if
about
that
this
person's
case.
listening, if you can confirm that you're referring
Yeah.
to the Lot 9 case, the Agua Caliente case, then I can talk about it. I know what it is.
Okay. Yeah, this person says yes, the one in the AIC court. So
Inter-American Court of
yeah,
Human Rights.
I think so.
Well, let's just, I'm pretty sure it is the same one, and I can summarize it quickly. It has to do with the mining resistance struggle that goes back to the coup. And I keep this short because we published a book about this stuff, Testimonial, Canadian mining in the aftermath of genocides in Guatemala. And then of all the mining resistance struggles documented in that book, one of them has to do with the Phoenix mine, the Phoenix nickel mine, which was from the from 64 right through to 2011. It was owned and controlled by a series of Canadian companies, Inco, Sky Resources, Hudbay Minerals. And then in 2011, it was passed over to a Swiss company called Solway Investment Group. And now Solway Investment Group has a new partner in the US called the Phoenix Mining Company. And so the 60-year nickel mining story in the Ellistor, which is the Maya-Kekchi region of the country, is an ongoing nightmare. And Rights Actions worked an awful lot on sort of all this stuff since 2004. One of the communities in the Ellistor region that's been so devastated, like many others, is a community called Lote Nueve, Lot 9, Agua Caliente. And they did, I know a lot about it. We used to fund there. We've taken delegations there. We funded their community after their leader, his sons were killed for the same reasons, community land defenders, indigenous land defenders fighting for their rights. But through a partnership with some activist lawyer groups in the US, and I forget the name of them, they filed a petition that went through the complicated Inter-American Commission of Human Rights process, then through to the Inter-American Court of Human Rights process. And the specific answer to your question is they absolutely got a very positive decision from the Inter-American Court of Human Rights, confirming what they've known all along, that that is their land and that they have title to that land, and the state has certain obligations to respect, guarantee, properly title the land, etc. It's a very important case that's gone mainly unnoticed, and little attention's being paid to it in government circles in Guatemala for all the obvious reasons. And yet it still is a hugely important legal precedent in the country, because the arguments were based on both ancestral indigenous ownership over land and more recent some land titling that had been done, officially titling in the government registries. And then literally, and this is what won the case, at a given point when they went to check the land registry book, 2 pages in the middle have been cut out, like torn out literally, just sort of skipped 2 full pages. So that's 4 pages of writing on either side. And this, I mean, that was just like the most blatant example of what happens all the time. But because they had proof of that their particular title, which had been from decades and decades ago, probably handwritten in the land registry book, that's how they were able to ultimately win their case. And it stands alone because all the land out there, like in many parts of Guatemala, is stolen land. If there was a functioning legal system and a decent political system in Guatemala, their courts would fill up within 5 or 6 years with land claims issues, not unlike a lot of the stuff that goes on in Canada and the US today, hundreds of years later, land claims issues that date back generations, if not hundreds of years. Most of the land in Guatemala is stolen indigenous land. And that region of the country is particularly egregious in all of that. One of the important issues with the Lote Ocho case in this lawsuit is that it's basically what's true about all of the mining harmed communities in that entire region. And so the mining company 50, 60 years of Canadian mining companies and now 10 years of the Swiss American company, they're fundamentally operating their mine on stolen land, and they have no fundamental underlying land title, let alone that they have faulty licenses. So that case is important for the community of Agua Caliente, Lote Ocho, and it has broader implications throughout the country.
So, in the interest of time, I'm going to move us from the legal aspects of Guatemala reality to some other topics. There are about 5 or 6 questions from the audience we need to get to in about 10 minutes. So I'm going to group some of these and collate them so that we can kind of speak to them all at once. So one of them has to do with immigration. And specifically about the initiative, the Biden-Harris initiative on Central America. If you all recall, Vice President Harris's infamous "Do Not Come" speech, which happened in Guatemala, I believe. So this person in the audience is asking basically, what is the status or what happened with the initiatives that the Biden-Harris administration laid out at the beginning of the administration? So let's go with that question first.
Ali, do you have a comment? And then I could add a comment. Ali, do you have something?
I'm not as familiar with that, but the part that I know about is supporting businesses like the large cell phone company Tigo with the idea of like creating jobs for Guatemala, which it has a lot of problems. So most people cannot access those types of jobs. The jobs themselves are not like with dignified wages that would really, improve someone's lot in life and discourage them from immigrating. And so just not a very well thought out comprehensive policy. But I'd like to hear more from Graham's perspective.
Well, I disagree with that. When you bring as your solution to forced migration a global capitalism free trade model of development, that is the very fuel that creates and stimulates the very reasons why people are fleeing in the first place. And this has been written about. There was a Los Angeles Times article a couple of years ago on that very point after Vice President Harris's visit to the region, which was, it's just pathetic. But what it is, sorry to be blunt, but it's just pathetic. But what it is it's saying the real problem here is you don't have enough investment. The real problem here, foreign investment and foreign ownership over your means of production to create jobs. But that's what every mining company says, and it just avoids the whole problem that this is a fundamentally flawed economic development model. If anyone
Grahme,
wants to know.
Yeah, sorry to interrupt, Graham. So related to the question that I just asked is what you're talking about, I think, which is, so what are the root causes of migration from Guatemala, and what can to the United States or North America, and what can the U.S. do to reduce them? I know that's a huge question and we don't have a lot of time, but I think that's what you were speaking to.
Well, it is. And so I wanted to finish the last point, because if someone wants the real type of economic development model that one should be looking at is, something like Santa Maria Tzeja. Like that is what a community-driven, community-owned vision of what good community-controlled and envisaged development should look like, just to take a micro example. And others can speak to it more. And there's many of those examples around Guatemala and around the world. That is never what's in offering from, sometimes people refer to the US-led West also as the Washington Consensus. It's basically the Western elite countries, the World Bank, the IMF, and all of our multinational companies and investor banks that see the whole planet as resources for the extractive industry, for the good land to be used to produce goods for export and sale, and then cheap labor. And half the answer to the question about what are the underlying causes of forced migration in the region, I gave in my historical timeline before. 70 years of the US-led West supporting brutal, exploitative, violent regimes. Where do we think all of those people fled to for the last 70 years? The co-host of Democracy Now, Juan Gonzalez, produced a series of films and books years ago, 20, 30 years ago, called um, uh, The Legacy of Empire. That's not what he called
Harvest
it.
of Empire, right?
Harvest of Empire.
Yep.
And read that book. Watch his documentary film. It is our political, military / economic policies from the global north, mainly the United States, but also Canada, that produce and reproduce the very conditions that force people to flee in the first place. They need transformational economic development model reform, but they'll never even get to that if they can't take back the political, legal, electoral system and the judicial system, which is in hands of the corrupt elite sectors. It's all intertwined. But if there's one, in my opinion, if there's one driving interest that underlies sort of 70 years of US-led West backing of this type of government and this type of model, it's always economic. Ultimately, we have economic political interests there. We're not just interested in violence for violence sake or supporting certain corrupt or leaders and calling them democratic allies just for the fun of it. We have long-term global economic political interests, and this is playing itself out in many regions of the world. Not, oh, something that's caught the news recently, the Middle East. Like a lot of this discussion we're having right now about Central America, multiply it by 100, and we're talking about the Middle East in many complex, intertwined ways. And it's always about global political economic control, and military is a tool of helping implement the maintenance, if we can, of our control. It's a bit simplistic as a generalization, but I think one sees it over and over and over again, time and again. And these are the very policies, the result of which is forces people to be fleeing all over the planet. Something like
Ali, yeah, Ali, do you have anything to add? I mean, maybe from the perspective of Santa Maria, kind of your thoughts on the sort of root causes of migration or immigration?
Sure. My internet's been really unsteady, so hopefully I don't get kicked out again. But I mean, yeah, I think Grahme hits it on the nail with the economic piece in terms of even though people have their own plots of land and they can grow crops, they're still at the whims of market forces, and they're also increasingly dealing with climate change. So Santa Maria Tzeja and the region heavily relies on cardamom as a cash crop, and they have since the 70s. But there's been very dry years for 2 years in a row, and most of the cardamom has died. And so that's another major push factor for immigration. And I think we're seeing it from parts of the region of the country that we hadn't seen immigration as much before. We're seeing increasing amounts because of the erratic weather patterns and inability for people to make ends meet with the traditional seeds and crops that they have.
So there's a few more additional questions, and I know we're coming up on time. So I wanna try to answer everyone's questions from the audience. So hopefully we can go through these pretty quickly. But I grouped these two together because we've been talking about aside from Guatemala, we've been talking about the United States, obviously, and U.S. foreign policy and U.S. interests in Guatemala. But of course, there are other countries in the world, and so some members of some people from our audience asked about China and Israel, and I think maybe let's start with Israel because someone asked. I'm assuming that this person is asking about the genocide that took place in Guatemala. But the question is, can you elaborate on Israel's role in Guatemala's history? And then the second question related to China is. What, if any, role is China playing in Guatemala? So a question about the past, Guatemala's history, and then a question about contemporary politics.
I can keep my part of the answer very brief. We've circulated over the last year, sort of coinciding with what's going on with the genocide in Palestine, which is again fully backed and legitimized by the US-led West. That is my own take on it, and I think it's been widely documented in many circles of the international community that doesn't get reported on, for the most part, in the media. And I do think there's a lot of similarities on certain levels with what happened in the 70s and 80s in Central America, and particularly Guatemala, with the US-led repression and genocides in Guatemala, in terms of the role of the US-led West, particularly in both these cases. In terms of, and then through all this, articles started circulating on the internet, reminding us of the role that Israel has played as a staunch ally of the United States in a lot of its foreign policy issues in different places of the world. And anyone can follow up with me after, and I can send to people just a series of these emails that we've circulated every 3 to 4 weeks, connecting the dots between US-led foreign policy in Latin America over the last 30 and 40 years and the role Israel's played, and then what's going on today in Palestine particularly. And for me, the best way to understand the role of Israel is as a longer-term partner of the US was the same way one would understand the role that in Guatemala that Pinochet's regime played in those key years, and the Argentinian generals played in those key years in the late 70s and early 80s, when they were brought in by the US as an ally to respond to certain sort of training needs, arming needs, direct support needs on the ground with the Guatemalan military and Salvadoran and Honduran, and training the Contras to help try and overthrow the government of the hated Sandinista army in the same time period. They were just more of what the US wanted to bring on the US side of the equation, supporting the 3 military regimes, El Salvador, Honduras, Guatemala, while trying to overthrow the government of Nicaragua. And other people have written about the similar roles that Israel played as an ally of the US, providing training, weaponry, etc., specialization with different regimes in the Americas, mainly in the 70s and 80s, but also continuing with certain governments right through till today. In terms of China, I don't know a lot about China's interest in the region. The US is clearly worried about them as a global competitor. I have no doubt that China is trying to expand its economic interests anywhere that they can expand them in the world, but I don't have any particular details.
Ali, if you don't have anything to add, I was going to move us to wrap up our question and answer with basically just your both of your final remarks. I mean, this has been such a fantastic presentation and discussion that's covered multiple areas, not only Guatemalan history, but the contemporary politics and the U.S. role historically and presently speaking. So we want to, of course, talk about what people can do. This webinar is asked the question, through looking at these 2 models of support or solidarity, the question of how can justice-seeking people support the Guatemalan people's efforts. So with that question, we want to conclude with some final remarks from the both of you. And so what actions can people be taking in North America, in the United States, now, and also, for looking ahead to 2025? We'll start with, actually, I will start with you, Ali, because Grahme just went. So we'll go Ali and then we'll do Grahme.
Okay, sorry, my internet's been really off, but hopefully you can hear me. I think, well, one thing I just wanted to put out is an invitation to anyone who wants to use this or enjoy this type of solidarity. I don't know what verb to use, but to employ this type of solidarity through the Guatemala partnership. There's always room for more. If anyone wants to join a delegation or become a partner family, it's just a really beautiful way. Sometimes, it's when we think of all the huge types of oppression in the world and all the problems that can feel so overwhelming. But when you have this person-to-person connection and support a particular community, it can feel more hopeful, more manageable. And we're also always looking for support for educational projects in Santa Maria Tzeja to raise the next generation of leaders to become movers, shakers, activists, and all of the roles that society needs for justice and well-being. So I will put a link in the chat so if folks want to check out the Guatemala partnership further. And thank you very much.
I would echo everything Ali said tonight, and I don't think anyone can do wrong in their life to sort of latch onto and support a project like Santa Maria Tzeja or some similar ones where you build lasting, long-term intergenerational relationships. And if that's all you do with your life, helping one community, because the multiplier effects, which Ali's alluded to, but you could go on for hours about how the intergenerational multiplier effects of how the first wave of students in the 90s and 2000s, where they are all at today and what they're doing. I don't think anyone can go wrong doing that for the rest of their lives as a model in and of itself, supporting grassroots, community-controlled, community-envisaged development, what their community needs and prioritizes. And then that's enough. If and when someone wants to get involved in the sort of the larger, so-called larger political, legal underlying issues or overarching issues or the economic issues, I always think the main focus has to be that we in the North, we have to hold ourselves accountable, whatever the country. I don't think the challenge is to hold the US or Canada accountable about Guatemala. It's about to hold the US accountable about all of our policies, the free trade agreements, promoting global markets, promoting global investments, which fundamentally means promoting our corporations and banks and investment firms to take over as much of the global resource grab as we can. And that is a driving issue that links many of these different countries. So either you go the specific route of choosing particular struggles in Guatemala, community development work, long-term, like Santa Maria Tzeja, picking a particular struggle, like a mining-related struggle related to a US company or a Canadian company, and staying with it, come hell or high water, as far as you can go, because that is their priority. And or you link it back through to, but I need to go home and change our policies. From the government level through our companies and to hold ourselves accountable. I think those are the two avenues to go. And then in terms of activist groups, besides plugging for Santa Maria Tzeja, which I would never stop doing, there's groups like Rights Action, NISQA, Guatemala Human Rights Commission, and other groups that are all working on different pieces of trying to expose to US audiences and draw in US activists to tweak one piece or another of US and or Canadian related policy. In Canada, we have Rights Actions in Canada as well, Breaking the Silence, and other groups in Canada that are doing this similar work, bringing the stories home, bringing the activism to the North. And then many of our groups end up partnering with other related struggles, because once you try and hold the US and Canadian government accountable for what they do in Guatemala, you might as well be partnering with groups that are trying to hold the US and Canada accountable for what our mining companies are doing in dozens of countries in Latin America and dozens in countries of Africa, because it's very similar. On the activism, the global North activism, we need to hold ourselves accountable for all of the impacts of our country, our governments and companies and banks. And it's not a Guatemalan issue. It's a Canadian-US issue that we need to transform. You've got two ways to go, and they're usually interconnected in many rich ways.
Thank you, Graham. Thank you, Ali. I think that those were some great, action steps that people can take if they want to get further involved. Or you cited quite a few organizations. So, folks, if you didn't catch all that, don't worry. We've been taking that down. We're going to send follow-up information with links and everything so that you can pursue that further according to your interests. I would be remiss if I didn't self-promote, or that is promote MAPA and what we're doing at MAPA. So as I said before, I'm the chair of Mass Peace Action's Latin American Caribbean Working Group. Our next meeting as a working group, we're on a bit of a sabbatical right now, is Monday, February 3rd at 5 o'clock Eastern on Zoom. So if you're interested in checking us out and the work that we're doing, feel free to email me. I'm going to put my email in the chat. I can give you the link and the agenda for that meeting when it comes up. And Brian is also putting the link to Mass Peace Action and the social media handles, so check that out. So we hope that in a good way, this was an information dump for all of you. And as we said before, we will follow up with all of this information in an email to you shortly. So that I hope you all enjoyed this presentation and our two featured guests, Ali and Grahme, two organizations that I highly respect and encourage you to get involved with and participate with. And as we said, we're on International Human Rights Day. We are looking to building the future now, as the Secretary General says. So we're looking ahead to 2025, and we hope this was useful to you. And so don't hesitate to reach out if you have any questions. I put my email in the chat. I'm sure Grahme and Ali would be happy to chat as well. But we hope you found this useful, and please be in touch in the months and the next year ahead. So thank you and have a great evening.
Thank you very much, everyone. Bye, Ali.